Hello, friends. We are in a troubling time when it comes to misinformation. The views of our guests do not reflect that of my own. This show is for entertainment purposes only, and any information presented during this show is a live-action role-play scenario. All that being said, enjoy this episode.
I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is. Eventually people are going to say, what the hell is going on? It's not enough to say it's nuts, you have to explain why it's so nuts. The invention of artificial life, the cloning of human beings, possible contact with extraterrestrials, the systems which are in place to keep the world sane are utterly inadequate to the forces that have been unleashed.
Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Today my guest is Ken Swartz. First, check out our website, forbiddenknowledge.news. It's the home of the Forbidden Knowledge Network. We feature some of your favorite content creators there. Also, watch a Forbidden documentary, Occult Louisiana, available on Tubi and multiple streaming platforms. Always be sure to download our podcast episodes directly through Spreaker. And we are booking guests for March. If you have suggestions or you'd like to be a guest, email me, forbiddenknowledgenews@gmail.com. Today I want to welcome back to the show Ken Swartz. He is founder and chief science officer of C60 PurplePower. He has run several research science laboratories over the course of his career and discovered C60 while developing the Moxie fusion reactor. Ken, welcome back. How you doing?
Doing pretty good. How are you doing up in the cold land?
It's cold, but we're doing good, trying our best to stay warm. Having a great time either way, and looking forward to the discussion. You sent me some very interesting topics that we're going to discuss today, such as NASA blunders, some that most never really hear about, and also, if we have time, you have made a discovery about new gravitational formulas, which they may be magnitudes more accurate than Newton's formulas, and were actually utilized by the Indian Space Research Organization in their endeavors to the moon. So this is fascinating. Before we get into this, remind the audience just a bit about yourself and your contributions to the world of C60 oils, and we'll get into a little bit of the benefits of that as well before we get too deep into these topics.
Oh yeah, I guess I'm C60 Power. I'm kind of like the C60 guy. I've been around for years and years, and of course you probably heard it. We got our C60 gummies. We've got our C60 products, but it all really started. I was working on the metal oxygen fusion reactor project and needed a radiation protection, so I went out and found this stuff called carbon 60. And because there's a lot of people, dead professors and late PhDs associated with Moxie fusion, and which is what we call it today. It used to be called Lenner and cold fusion, but it's solved. It's got solutions. It's got patents, and it's got multiple third-party verification. So that part's all finished. But what it is, after taking C60, because they gave one set of rats C60, the other didn't. They hit them with a fatal dose of radiation, and the C60 rats lived, where the other ones died. Well, obviously, that's what you want to have when you're doing radiation. So obviously, we took it. We're all still alive. And then when I went to get about 7 months later, I kept taking C60. I had more energy, better mental focus. And when I went to get checked for my optometrist, my annual checkout, my drusen of dry macular degeneration had disappeared. And then after I learned that was pretty amazing, because he'd never seen that happen before. I made it a product for my electrical engineer, Gary Rodriguez, because he had type 2 diabetes, and that causes macular degeneration often. And so I made a formulation in MCT oil for him, and he took it for about 15 months, and his severe wet macular degeneration went away. Still gone today, which is a medical miracle. Supposedly can't happen, but basically, and then finally, anyway, one thing led to the other, and now it's people are using C60 all over the world. I kind of was the guy that built the market. just by telling people about it and sharing it with people, and the company built up. Now there's dozens of companies, but we're kind of like the original that kind of brought it out. But it's just if you want better energy, better mental focus, it really gets the mitochondria going. And quite frankly, if you're in the gray hair crowd, that's where C60 is going to get you the best. You get a little slow, things aren't working as well as you get older. You know how that goes. I do. So taking C60 kind of restarts all that good stuff. And you can go to the websites, shopc60.com, and read about it. There's also a website, whatisc60.org. It's kind of one of those 501(c)(3)s, and it has like all the whole story about carbon 60 and all of its health benefits, which we can't post because, three-letter agencies say things.
Right.
So you just go there to whatisc60.org and learn all about it. And that's probably long enough, because we have more things to talk about, and we can always talk about C60
Right
later. Interested,
Yeah.
But there's always new things happening with C60. It's got a lot of industrial applications as well.
Incredible product. I still use it every day. My pets use it. If you want to learn more, use the link right in the description, and you still can get 10% off your entire order. All right, so let's get into some NASA blunders that most folks may have never even heard about.
Well, I guess the big one is Apollo 13. Of course, you remember that. It was on the way to the moon, and the oxygen tank blew up. Well, I was talking to my dad, who was actually in the Apollo programs. I could probably talk about that later. But what he'd said is that oxygen tank, it had some internal stuff in it. What happens is they were building the Apollo 13, and one of the guys with the forklift had gone there to pick the tank up and was taking it out, and it fell. It fell about 6 feet and hit the ground. And then they looked at it and said, "Oh, it looks pretty good to me." And they put it back on the pallet, and it went into Apollo 13. Of course, what those idiots didn't know is that there was a bunch of internal stuff in that for valve regulation and things, because you want to pack things up, and so it was inside the thing. So looking at it, from the outside, of course, eventually NASA did, I think I was the one that broke the story, and NASA finally had to admit that had actually happened, but they say it fell 3 inches. Right? Yeah, never a straight answer. Yeah, well, 3 inches, right?
Let's address some of the conspiracies before we get too deep into some of the blunders, because this is a conspiracy show, and I know for a fact there are plenty of folks that not only question the NASA narratives and things coming out that are supposedly real pictures and real videos from the moon landing, question that the moon landing even happened. We have the flat earth conspiracies. So first of all, let's address some of those moon landing conspiracies. Did we actually go, and why is the footage that we see not matching up? Why is there are so much inconsistencies and strange things that really point to, at the least, some doctored footage?
Oh, yeah, there is something. Well, first off, we did go to the moon, and the Japanese have sent spacecrafts to the moon, and they have taken pictures of the Apollo landing sites. Okay, so have the Chinese. So you can go out there and find the Japanese photos. I'm not sure how much the Chinese put up, but so you can actually do that. So other people, Russians have probably taken pictures too, and I don't know if they don't post much of anything ever. So well for that. But so yeah, we were there. Now there actually was a moon video, because they had to, on the first landing on the moon, they weren't sure whether the people would survive, and so as a backup for that, I think it was Johnson or Nixon, whoever it was, I think it was Nixon that does that, whatever it was. Anyway, they actually did make a film, because they were figuring if they landed on the moon and crashed, what they do is they made a film that they pretend that they had actually landed on the moon, and then during the takeoff from the moon, there was a terrible accident and the astronauts died. And that way they could at least, claim that they got there, rather than they just crashed on the moon's surface. But no, that's actually there. People have seen you can actually, other countries have sent their spacecraft to the moon. You can see the landing site. So it's there. And also, one of the things on the landing site, they put up these special mirrors there that always reflect back the way you set them. They're like a cubical solid mirror, and they use a laser pulses from the Earth will fire at this mirror on the moon, and then of course the light flights back, and you can measure within like millimeters how far away the moon is from the Earth. And this is part of an ongoing science project, and so you can actually, you can go to the place and see them do it. Or if you really had enough money, you'd go do it yourself. So how did that reflective mirror get on the moon that you yourself could fire a laser at and get a reflection back if somebody hadn't put it there, right? So it's pretty obvious that yeah, we went to the moon. But there's a lot of things like all the it's all the lunar photos actually go to a private corporation before they're released to us, because it's illegal in certain ways for government to censor things, but it's perfectly okay for private. So I don't know if you remember Jose Escamilla and Moon Rising.
No.
Okay, yeah, he's passed away, but he was like one of those. He made a lot of UFO films, Roswell Rods, and one of them was Moon Rising. And on the Celeste mission, which was one of the first, I think it was just an orbiter around the moon. And then they released the photos, but and because there's all kinds of objects and other things on the moon's surface, right? People say alien bases and leftovers, old ruins and things. So there's a bunch of stuff up there, and they don't want to see it. But in the Moon Rising, Jose Escamilla, I think you can get it. You can get the stuff from Gaia if you want to buy it. And is back in the day when they did, because Jose was a movie producer. Is what they did is they airbrushed stuff out, right? But they didn't blend it. They didn't understand the concept of blending it. So they just brush out. So you'd see like dome that was brushed out. You'd see like a little square building that was brushed out. So yes, they brushed out all this strange anomalous stuff on the moon, but they just brushed out the object. They didn't blend it. So you couldn't tell. So you could actually go up there. Do you see all these, these strange areas where, you could see that it's been blended. I mean, it's not been blended, but it's been brushed out, but it's not been blended. So you could see the silhouette of all the things they did. And so there's a lot of ruins and other stuff. Who knows, maybe an active bases of the moon.
So would you say that's why what we see of the moon landing may be a fabrication compared to what was really there?
Yeah, the other moon landings are probably more. They could have. I don't know if they used the fabrication or they actually used the real leads from it. It depends. But they did have a film in reserve that they had made on thing, because my dad was in the NASA thing. He actually, I'll tell you how he got into the Apollo program. He was the expert on the Thor missile, and so he had so like when Bluegill Prime had problems blowing up on the pad, they sent him out there to fix that situation. That was vapor lock and the kerosene pumps. But and then another time when Genie missile kept getting sabotaged, they put him in charge of the Genie missile program, and he managed to get around the saboteurs, who in the end were actually aliens, not commies. And that's another story. And then, so they sent him on to the moon, because what had happened is they couldn't get enough thrust out of the Apollo 1 rocket, the first stage, to get to the moon. And so they sent my dad there, and my dad's there, was sitting on a table with 12 Germans, Werner von Braun and his crew. And he goes up, he goes looking at the thing. He says, this just looks like a bunch of V1s put together. And Werner von Braun said, that is exactly what it is. But so they needed 4% more thrust out of the rocket engines from the Saturn V, but they couldn't get them. And so my dad was there 6 months, and I guess he can't really claim, even though he's directing it, the fixing. But one day, one of the fuel pumps broke, and the bearing broke. The drive shaft kind of broke, and so the pump was just spinning free in the pipe, and they got 7% more thrust.
Oh wow!
So they just got rid of the pump and they put in a straight pipe, and we went to the moon. So I guess it's not quite a heroic way to get to the moon, but that's the kind of one of the barrier that got them to the moon. So they got over it, which is just by accident.
Well, you hear the transmissions from the trip to the moon, where the astronauts are saying that there are other objects kind of following them along.
Yeah, they call it Santa Claus. And then the last time, the Apollo 17 mission, when the Apollo spacecraft left the moon's gravity and then went into the Earth's gravity, because you could listen, ham radio operators could listen in on this, and a lot of them recorded it, right? So you could actually listen to the Apollo astronauts talking to NASA. There wasn't any way they could censor that. And they'd say things like, "Oh, we see Santa Claus," Well,
yeah,
that wasn't, exactly. But there was a big transmission. Everybody on Earth heard it and said, "Do not return." And so that's why we never went back from Apollo 17. And they actually made 20 Apollos. So there was 3 that were sitting around. One of my friends flew on one on a special mission. I can't talk about it. He can someday. So that takes care of one of them. But there still was 2 Apollos left, and I don't know what what the Air Force used. Air Force took that. That's why a lot of that NASA stuff disappeared about the Apollo stuff, is because the Air Force went in there and cleaned out the documents because they had 3 Apollos left, right? And they used one on a special mission that I know of, and they have 2 others, and I don't know what they might have used those on other missions as well. So because
Wow.
20 were built, so
That's so interesting.
that's yeah. With maybe someday we'll finally learn about those other 3 missions, which
Right
were all
on.
classified, of course.
Well, going back to the NASA blunders, talk a little bit about the loss of a Mars orbiter.
Oh yeah, it was called the Mars Climate Orbiter. And what it is, they were sending it to Mars, of course, and Mars, unlike the moon, has an atmosphere, and so they have this maneuver called aerobraking. And that's where you just barely have the spacecraft touch the top of the atmosphere because it takes a lot of energy. Like if you want to slow down a spacecraft, you'd have to like have a bigger tank and all that kind of stuff. So to get over those limitations, you can just hit the very top of the atmosphere just right, and it'll slow your spacecraft down you have a heat shield, right? So it doesn't burn up, and you slows your spacecraft down just enough to get into orbit. And so that was the maneuver they were going to do with the Mars Climate Orbiter. But what happened is, Lockheed Martin, which is down the street from me here, is they have a lot of periodic mergers and acquisitions, and they're corporate, kind of a crooked corporate structure there. And so kind of what happened is in one of their periodic cost-cutting measures, they basically had fired off all the mid-level people who were really the skilled people in it, and they had to go elsewhere. And what they were left with is really young kids out of college, right? They're going to train up for cheaper labor, and really, really old guys that are like running the department, right, or running the division. And the problem is, a lot of these old guys, they go on the old methods, right? They use foot pounds, pre-metric kind of things that we used in the 60s and even into the 70s. And a foot pound is less than a Newton. Well, the metric system uses a Newton, right? Newton metric system. And it's basically the amount of energy it takes to raise a kilogram, I believe, 1 meter. Whereas a foot pound is just like it sounds. It takes the amount of energy to raise a pound 1 foot, right? It's like a gravitational metric or amount of energy. And so what happened is, the guys from JPL, which is in California, and they're younger guys, and they all use Newtons, right? They're all in the metric system. That's their total thing. So to get the insertion orbit, the guy from JPL calls up the guy in Lockheed Martin, who's just an older than, old as dirt kind of guy who uses foot pounds. And so he says, how much thrust do we need to get into orbit? So the old guy tells the young guy the amount in foot pounds, but the young guy doesn't even know what foot pounds is or even understands there's that problem. So he punches that in Newtons.
Oh, no.
And they don't really know what happened to the Mars Climate Orbiter. Did it bounce off the atmosphere because it came in too hard and bounced off? Or did it burn up in Mars atmosphere and impact the surface somewhere as fragments? We really don't know. But that's that little mistake. That was like a $300 million mistake or something. So.
Right
And
on.
that's not the only one. There's also the Mars Polar Lander.
Yeah.
And the Mars Polar Lander was another one they were going to send there, and they're going to kind of land it near Mars poles. Now the problem is, it comes back to my gravitational formulations.
Yeah.
Is that when Newton was a great guy, and what he did is he math is not reality. Math poorly describes reality, and so you have to use abstractions. So what Newton did with his formulations is he shrunk the entire Earth, its volume and its mass, into an infinitesimal abstract point, right? It's an abstraction. And then let's say we shrink the moon into an infinitesimal point, and because we have 2 infinitesimal points, we can actually measure gravity between them, right? But the problem with the Newton measure is that from that infinitesimal point, a perfectly spherical gravitational field spreads out from it. And in the age of sailing ships, that's perfectly fine. But in the age of spacecraft, it doesn't work quite so well. And like, for instance, the Earth, because it spins, it's a little wider around the equator than it is between the poles, because, it kind of bulges out, right? It's not but if you use Newton's things, a perfectly spherical gravitational field comes out with your math, right? That's your math. And obviously the gravitational field is not perfectly spherical. Now, Mars is actually more oblate than the Earth. The Earth's about 0.3%, Mars is 0.5%. So when they were doing the calculations for landing on Mars, I actually went back after the Mars polar lander failed and looked at what they were using, and they were using strict Newtonian values, right? Which means that they were estimating gravity higher than it actually was at the area they were landing on Mars near the pole. There, that's why they call it the Mars polar lander. So what happened is when you come into Mars, obviously they have what they do is they come in and they have an aerobrake because it's got an atmosphere, right? So just kind of like a lot of our stuff. So you come in and they have the aerobrake comes on and it slows down the craft. And when it slows down enough, you have some parachutes pop off. And even though Mars' atmosphere is thin, the parachutes work. And then the craft slows down even more in the parachutes till it gets about 4 kilometers above the surface. And then the parachutes kick loose and then the retro rockets burn. And in the Mars polar lander, they were going to have the retro rockets burn until they were about, somewhere 10 meters above the surface, and then the final like guidance would come in and would land it, right? Well, the problem was if you calculate gravity at up to 0.5% up more stronger than it is, that means your thrust is more, right? You're burning more, and so when it finally kicks on I guess the guidance control kicks on a few meters above the surface. Instead of being 10 meters above the surface of Mars, it's now could be 100 meters above, 200 meters above the surface of Mars. And that basically, we don't really know what happened. Did it overcome the mission parameters and the computer just shut down? Did it run out of fuel trying to land? We don't know. NASA gives a lame excuse, but never a straight answer. So you can't believe that. But in the meantime, I knew Dr. Peter Smith. And he was running the Phoenix lander. And it's exactly the same as the Mars polar lander. I mean, exact same platform, a couple different instruments, and they're all going to land in the same area. So he used to go to the Mars Society meetings like I did. And so I knew him. We'd go out and sit and drink beers with some of the other guys. And they'd talk about what the gray aliens they were working with, they're doing in the lab. Yeah, sometimes when you get to the back things and all the scientists get together and start drinking, they tell stories. Huh. So that's... the ones that are working for, anyway, alcohol has a way of doing that. So
we're going to have to come back to that later, but continue.
Yeah, but so I knew him. So I sent him a letter, gave him a call, sent him a letter with all the information. Now he couldn't believe that JPL and NASA could not get gravity right on Mars. But, and I don't think he used my mathematical formulations. But what he did do is when unlike the Mars polar lander, the minute that parachute kicked on and the retro rocket engine started 4 kilometers, he made sure that the radar altimeter was working right there. He put guidance control the minute that engine turned on, guidance control was on, and so it guided the spacecraft down and landed on Mars successfully. It's the exact same platform. So he just changed the programming a little bit because he didn't want it to fail.
Well, this leads to some of the gravitational formulas that you discovered. I'd like to hear all about this and how you came across it.
Well, what I did is I was doing my master's thesis, the retention of magnetic fields on rotating terrestrial planets through the actions of a close large orbital partner. And basically what it is if the moon, Earth would suddenly be here, I guess we're a little close, but basically if we had the moon, right, if the moon kind of pulls the inner core of the Earth off center, and because the Earth rotates faster than the moon orbits, it causes the inner core of the Earth to rotate faster than the rest of the planet, and that creates the friction and currents that create the Earth's magnetic field. In fact, I predicted that the moon's core would rotate faster than the Earth's core would rotate faster than the rest of the planet before it was actually discovered to do so. Just to let there it goes. And you can go on. Actually, I don't think it's posted online. I could give it to one of the people out there listening. Want to get that? I'll send it to them for free. It's just I haven't really posted it anywhere, but so that was I was doing it, and the problem was because Newton has that perfectly spherical gravitation. When I wanted to put all these whistles and bells in it, and say, oh, look at this, here it is there, and I discovered that Newton's formulation was totally worthless to do any of that because it makes these perfectly spherical gravitational fields. And the way they actually plot gravity on the Earth's surface is just like a fitted curve. They have this formulation with a fitted curve. It has nothing to do with any parameters of the Earth. And so I said, oh, I can fix this. So I started working on formulations to do it. But my master's thesis, Dr. Wyckoff, said, don't do that. Your thesis is radical enough. without trying to introduce a bunch of new gravitational formulations. So I just finished the thesis without them, and then I finished up the formulations, and they've been around for 2.5 decades. Okay, so it's not like it's nothing new. I have them posted on ResearchGate. If you go to my site on ResearchGate, just type in my name, and you can read them there. I'll send you some links. We could probably put them in the poster. So, and all I did is it was like Newton. What I did is Newton made an infinitesimal point, right? So what I did is I turned the planet into an infinitesimal line that goes across the planet, the diameter of the planet, depending on what angle it is. And so I just went from an infinitesimal point to an infinitesimal line, and that allows me to get 3 magnitudes more accurate. So you can actually calculate the gravity of Earth or Mars or anywhere to almost exact values, using the physical parameters of the planet itself, or the physical parameters of the moon itself. And so that's it's really just another abstraction. And you can derive Newton's formulation from my formulation if you break it down. So it's the same thing. Basically,
and these formulations were actually used for a mission to the moon.
Oh yeah, they used them, but they weren't very accurate, and so but in the case that's why when Neil Armstrong, and that's probably where I should probably bring in the whole moon thing here is, although people think the moon is a sphere, it's actually kind of egg shaped, and so it's the moon's is really it's egg shaped. We look at it this way, right? Okay. If we were looking at the moon, it looks round, but if we were actually in orbit and looked at the moon, this is of course greatly exaggerated. The moon's kind of egg shaped with the bigger part of the egg facing the Earth, right? It kind of bulges out, so it's kind of like it's what's called a prolate. It's kind of a prolate body, and so that's kind of how the moon is, and that's the first thing you got to do for calculating the gravity on the Earth, because the Earth is oblate. It's like spins, and so it's wider across the equator than it is between the poles. But the moon being prolate, it's farther across the poles than it is across the equator. And so the first thing you need to do, but when you're going to land on the moon or any gravitational locked planet, you have to change the poles. Now, when we went to the moon and the way that they have it now, if you look at like a moon globe, they gave the moon a north pole and a south pole, and then they put latitude and longitudes around that, which is, because that's the way we do it on the Earth. And it's correct, because the Earth is rotates, and they put the north pole and the south pole at the rotational axis, right? And then they do the latitude and longitude from that. Well, which is okay, but the moon isn't that. The moon's prolate, it's gravitationally locked. And so when you want to do mapping on the moon, the poles you want is like the point closest to the Earth, right? That's called the near Earth point, or the near planet point. And then the point farthest, the point farthest from the Earth, that's the far Earth point. Those are the 2 poles. And then the equator, like the edge that we see from the Earth, is actually the equator of the moon, right? And so it's kind of weird doing this because I have to look at the thing. So so that's what you got to do. So you got to do that. And so first you have to map the moon. So instead of being, a moon north-south pole, you've got this equator, and then you do your latitudes and longitudes from that. And then once you get that, that's the first thing you got to do. You got to remap the moon with, the near Earth pole and the far Earth pole, and the rim is the equator, and then you can put my maps in and land successfully on the moon, which is what the ISRO did. And you remember there's a big race for the moon here recently, last year. And it's actually a moral lesson, because the first one was the Indians launched their Chandrayaan-3 probe, which I was actually what happened is it was I think in March of last year or May of last year, probably I think it was May, and is that their iSpace had sent their probe to the moon and it had crashed. And iSpace is a private Japanese company, but it kind of works with the Japanese government, the U.S. government. There's kind of a public-private partnership there. And so it had crashed. And so I said, oh, man, I wonder why it did that. And I looked at it and I said, oh, these people should, I figured it was the math they were doing and some metrics problems. And so I should probably I should contact. And I was looking on it and I realized their headquarters, even though it was a Japanese company, was like 10 miles from where I live.
Ah.
It was out at the airport nearby.
Wow.
Centennial Airport. And so I said, well, that's crazy. So I wrote up the papers and stuff and sent it and went by and just dropped them off. And I know they gave it to I know it worked its way up to the Japanese government part of things, whether they use it or not, because the Japanese did send a space probe, but maybe it encouraged them to do it. In the meantime, when I was doing that, I was looking at and I discovered, whoa, the Indians are about to send a space probe to the moon, and their organization called the ISRO, and there it was like a month, 2 month and a half away, and but I'm not going to tell how, but I have contacts within the Indian Space Research Organization or people that are associated with that. So we sent it off to them, and they said thank you, and they sent us a cool video of it taking off. That's yes. Anyway, and so the IRS, but the IRSO, the Indians do things very precision wise. Like for instance, they sent for that. Remember that cost Interstellar, that movie Interstellar.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how many hundreds of billions of dollars it was, but the Indians actually built a rocket, built a space probe, sent it to Mars, and and India has it in orbit. It's a weather satellite in orbit around India for less money than that movie.
Wow.
So the Americans make fantasy movies about going to space, whereas the Indians actually go out and make something that's real that actually is there. They have a very methodological way of doing it. So what they did is when they took it off in the Earth, it went around the Earth like 4 or 5 times, each time gaining a little bit more energy, till finally it went to the moon, and then it was going 4 or 5 times around the moon before it was slowing down gradually, adjusting, and before it came down to land successfully near the moon's quote south pole. Actually, it's the lower quadrant of the equator, but that's what so I sent them about because the key is the mapping. You got to map the moon correctly, and with the near Earth pole and the far Earth pole, and then you can do the mass. Any mass would work better, but you got to do the mapping first. But in the meantime, the Russians had spies in the Indian Space Research Organization, and they had discovered they already had the new formulations, but they didn't know how to map the moon correctly, and that kind of stuff. So they decided they were going to beat the Indians to the moon. So they pulled this space probe that lunar lander they'd had sitting gathering dust for like 10 years or whatever, and they stuck it on a rocket and they launched it straight at the moon, right? They didn't take any 4 or 5 orbits, and they were going to race the Indians to the south pole of the moon and land successfully. But when they were trying to insert around the moon, I guess they got into one orbit, and then they were going to fire the rockets. And this is what they said what happened is that because all the guys that worked on it had gone away, right? They'd been gone for 10 years, right? They went on other jobs, so they had these other guys running it, and they say there was a software glitch, and instead of burning like 37 seconds or whatever it was, it burnt like 108 seconds. And so what happened is basically impacted on the surface of the moon. They couldn't do a double insert, and so it's kind of like the tortoise and the hare. The Indians were like the tortoise and successfully crossed the finish line, where the Russians were like the hare to crash their spacecraft to the moon. So it was but Putin was good about it and congratulated the Indians. So
Wow.
that was it. And then in the meantime, which is the Japanese they pulled their spacecraft, their lunar lander out of mothballs and sent it to the moon. And we're going to land near the south pole of the moon. But what happened is we don't know, whether they used the math or not, or the mapping of the moon or not, but because what happened is that the thing was landing. The Japanese have we're using these ceramic metallic thrusters on the little nozzles on the end of the rocket engines, and one of them apparently snapped off several meters above landing, and so the probe tried to adjust, but it ended up upside down, which is unfortunate, and But the other one that the people that never listen to us, which is NASA, so we don't even waste time talking to those losers, because they're all about I don't have a PhD, I just have a master's, so and who are we? And so they didn't, of course, listen to us, never will. And the U.S. military, of course, uses my math. That's another thing. It's another story. But anyway, for their ballistic missiles, I mean, without my math, no anti-satellite missile system works, basically. Or anti-missile system. That's another thing. That was remember, this thing's over 2.5 decades old, and that stuff happened decades ago. But so what happened is when they sent there was a public-private thing called the Odyssey moon lander, and so it was going to come in and land at the moon. But the problem is if gravity near the quote south pole of the moon, which is the lower quadrant of the equator, is actually higher than what you would calculate using Newtonian. And so there is no atmosphere on the moon to slow you down. So they have nothing but electronics. So what's going to happen is they put radar altimeters on the spacecraft, right? That tells it how far above the moon it is, but it can't adjust for horizontal motion. So when you make gravity higher than it actually is, right? It's like you made the surface come up. So what you want to do when you come down and land, you want to make sure your horizontal and vertical motion are perfectly zero, and you hit exactly right, and you land successfully. Well, if you make it come up higher, you with the radar altimeter, you can adjust the vertical thing, but you can't adjust the horizontal speed. So the spacecraft came in with some horizontal speed, and it just fell off on its side. That's why the Odyssey fell over its side, because they couldn't adjust, because they don't know how to do gravitational form. They don't know how to calculate gravity correctly on the moon. So they couldn't adjust for horizontal motion. And of course, they crashed on its side. And that's actually why a lot of lunar spacecraft have failed on the moon, because they can't calculate gravity. In fact, when the first space landing on the moon, right, when Neil Armstrong was landing, they had more gravity, because if you're actually on the near point of the Earth, which is where they landed near here, there's actually gravity is actually lower than what is estimated by Newton's formulations. And so that was the extra fuel, because he was coming down to land, and there was all these boulders and rocks in the way, and so he had to move it to another space. And they said, where did the extra fuel come from? It should have run out of fuel and crashed. Well, that's because gravity was less. And so anyway, that's the story of it, and that's why we landed successfully on the moon the first time, just because they couldn't calculate gravity correctly. If they'd actually done it, they might have had to abort the mission. But
Right.
oh well.
Well, I'd love to get your thoughts on some theories that I've heard over the years about the moon, about what the moon could be. I've heard everything from it maybe an artificial satellite that was not always here, to, of course, it being hollow in the center and maybe contains some sort of life forms or humanoids that reside there. What are your thoughts on some of these?
Well, I don't know if you know the Future Forecasting Group, right? Dick Allgaier.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. They did a recent one on that. You can go on YouTube and they have part of it. Of course, you have to go become a private member to see it all. And they actually discovered a granite pluton in the moon, which is kind of unusual, because we have granite plutons here, and they make the big mountains, but they form underneath the surface, and then they kind of move up and solidify. But they also have a lot of water in them, because water has to be associated with it. So they went and looked at a crater right above where this granite pluton, because it's also warmer, because the plutons, they tend to have potassium in it. They take a lot of the potassium, and potassium is radioactive. There's a lot of potassium-40, so so it was more radioactive than the rest of the moon, and it was also warmer, and they could actually tell that by their surveys of the surface. But also, when the granite pluton forms, you should have water and sulfur dioxide and other things coming off the surface, which if in the moon, they could have gone up, they kind of be like hot water veins going up, and then they probably deposit when they hit a colder surface above the moon. They would deposit, so there might be ice deposits deep under. And they did a thing, and they saw these humanoid people living in a industrial plant down there. Huh. So I don't know what the name. It's on the which would be exactly, because if you wanted to look for minerals and metals and gases such as water, you could get water and all that. That would be the place you want to be. So they saw some sort of underground mining going on. And which makes sense, because if you were going to do mining on the moon, that's the only place you would do it. So deep mining. So they were probably going to.
We've got to get to the aliens. I heard you mention earlier scientists that may have had a little bit too much to drink and say too much, talking about working with gray extraterrestrials. Is that correct?
No, they were government agents, people that worked in the government laboratories and stuff. And yeah, they have interactions with them. And they were sharing technology. The little extraterrestrials would share technology. They're kind of like disposable units. They're like clone units. So the real masters don't come down probably hang out with the Earthlings, but they send their kind of bio butts down to work with humans. So
right now, you sent me also an incident about how possibly aliens sabotage the Genie missile program.
Oh yeah, that's kind of a funny program. Yeah, the Genie missile program. If you go, and you can, in fact, I'll send a link. You could go online to YouTube, and you can see my dad fly wing. He's the wingman on when they launched it. It was an air-to-air missile, and it had a 3 kiloton nuke on it. and could be fired from the bottom of a jet at another aircraft. And allegedly, they were going to be used to shoot down Soviet bombers, because the Soviets were going to fly their bombers in fleets, right, into the United States, and they would fire one of these genies and it would blow up the whole fleet of Soviet bombers. Not that the Soviets would be that stupid, they would fly them separately. And the problem is the Soviets didn't even have 100 bombers at the time, yet they made 3,000 genie missiles, right? So the claim is what it is, but let us say that they were designed to shoot down flying saucers, because they figure even if they couldn't do anything, if you could, they can't. It's like horseshoes and hand grenades. If you get close, you get some points. So that's basically why it was built. But my dad didn't know about that at the time and everything. But the Genie missile project, so it was, they were building it, and it had been sabotaged again and again. And so my dad had been like the special on the Thor missile, which is, and ran that program to help that thing, and Bluegill Prime. So they put him in there because he'd kind of run programs and to do that. And so what his thing, he knew it was going to be sabotaged. It had been sabotaged before a couple of times. So what he did is he had two missiles being built. He had like the public missile that everybody could see behind glass and the people out there working on it. And he had another missile being built in a back room, and he's the only one that had the key to the door and had pretty heavy security on that. So when they work on the first missile, they get it working and everything running, and then they would secretly go to the second room and put it in, which made it go faster because it's, they'd already got some experience. And so finally, you had the two missiles were built. Finally, it was like the day before it was going to be used. And of course, that was the day that they knew that the saboteurs were going to kind of go after it, right? And so they put the kind of the public missile out it'd been on several pallets out in this public place, and they had some, it was in a concrete place with strings, and they had put like warning tape and barriers and stuff all around it. But it was like bait, right? It was bait. Because they have the real missile hidden away, and this is the bait missile, so the saboteurs would go after the bait and not go after the real one, right? So they just were planning, and so they had put up tape and barrier signs and fences and all this stuff, right? Which made it virtually impossible for anybody to get to the missile, right? You'd have to work pretty hard at it. And but this is what happened during the night. One of the guys in the warehouse, right, that moved things around, he got this sudden urge. He needed to get the pallets from underneath the missile, right? That was the excuse he did, even though there were pallets available in the warehouse. So what? And so this guy goes up in there and he removes all the tape and the barriers and stuff, right? And there was guards around the second missile's room, but they didn't have any guards around the bait missile, right? Because that's how you do things. And so the guy goes in there and he removes all the barriers and stuff and the tape and tests and do a whole bunch of work to do this. Go past the signs. Do not touch this missile. Do not go away. This dude, stay away. Top, whatever. And then he goes in there to lift the missile off to get the pallet. And of course, the missile tips off and falls and gets damaged. And then the general comes in the next day, says, "Oh my God, my career's over. The missile's destroyed. Oh, what am I going to do?" And my dad says, "Oh, don't worry. That's just the show missile. This is the real missile." And he goes in and he opens the door and shows it to him. He didn't even told the general running the program, my dad was a major back then, what was really going on, because he didn't know where the leak was, right? Yeah. And of course, this warehouse guy, that runs the forklift, they took him away and probably subjected him to enhanced interrogation techniques. And the thing was, when they were done enhanced interrogating him, they could not figure out. He wasn't being paid by the commies. He wasn't being, they just couldn't find any reason. It's like somebody took over his mind and had him do that. And probably what it is, if we could dig up his carcass, wherever it is, if he did get buried, and look at his brain, I'll bet you'd find some sort of chips. Because, this missile was made basically to shoot down flying saucers in alien spacecraft. It was a nuclear missile. It had been sabotaged time and time again, and then it got sabotaged the last one. But my dad outwitted the aliens. So if you can go online, I'll give you the link, and you can. I think I gave it to you earlier, and you can actually see him fly wingmen, because some of the guys that worked in the program, because they were going to blow it up in the air. It's launched from an aircraft, and then it blows up in the high altitude, like, I don't know, 20,000 feet or whatever. So these guys all decided to get on ground zero on the ground and have like a party. And then the missile would blow up above them. The nuke would. My dad thought that was kind of stupid. He'd rather be in the airplane.
Yeah, right.
up high where he was in control, rather than because he was an old fighter pilot and transport pilot for the back. So he was up there flying the wingman on the guy that actually launched the missile. And so then you could actually see the fools down there at ground zero, and they have their glasses on, and then there's the big explosion. They could boom, and then they get out their cigars and start smoking. The general didn't figure that was a bad idea too.
Right. Yeah.
It was the younger officers who had more balls than sense. So that's how, that was like one sabotage operation that the aliens didn't get.
Now, could it have been possible that it may have just been a foreign adversary that was using some kind of technology to influence them?
That was the 50s, right?
Mm.
Late 50s. And there wasn't anybody that had any technology like that, or even like the mind control, other stuff. Because we have our guys, we had the Frankfurt School and the MK Ultra dudes, right, back then. So they definitely, some of them, and some ex-Nazis probably, we have ways of interrogating you correctly.
Yeah.
So they worked the guy over, and there was nothing there. It was not a foreign adversary. And they made 3,000 of these things, right, with the nukes on the little tip on them. Yeah. The Russians didn't have 100 bombers, right? So why do you need 3,000 of them, right? So yeah, it was definitely designed to fight alien invasion, because you could fire nukes at them. And so it did go through, and we did get our little anti-flying saucer nukes. So it was successful in that case.
Well, while we're in alien territory still, I've heard all the theories about how our military is possibly involved with extraterrestrial intelligence. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on how long we've possibly had this relationship and what's the benefit to them, to the extraterrestrials.
Well, I think there's a whole bunch of different extraterrestrials. We could talk, I didn't really get into those books. We could pull out it's called the Friendship Case.
Yeah, I've heard about the Friendship.
Italy, yeah, that's probably one. And that one, you have several different groups, and they're all fighting each other, over, they have the human agents. A lot of them have human agents because you can't do that. And they have one group as the agents of the reptoids probably. And then they have these other humans or agents for others, and they're all battling, but sometimes they work together, right, for things so you didn't really know. It's several groups, what it is. It's not just one. It's kind of, imagine, as so above, so below, as without, so within, that kind of thing. And so I think, Earth is like one of those third world countries, maybe an island country, right, during the Cold War. And so you got the Soviets, right, and the Americans are, trying to get control of that country for its resources and strategic value. But then you also got things like the British and the Chinese, right? And maybe corporations. So you get all of these multiple corporations. So, the Americans and the British probably work together sometimes, right, to fight off the Soviet stuff. But, there might be corporate interest where British corporations are going to be wanting to do different things. So sometimes they'll be in conflicts. So I think it's something very similar to that, where you have multiple species, and each one has various agendas, and some of the agendas are just screwing the other ones over and preventing them from getting a foothold. So it's really hard to tell, other than you read these stories, and obviously they're fighting each other on the Earth, but then they also have things to keep the humans under control. So there's things that they agree with, things they disagree with, but they're definitely in competition, sometimes deadly competition with each other. But sometimes they cooperate on other things. So it's sort of like that. So it's sort of like an extraterrestrial Cold War kind of situation going on.
I've heard you mention the tall whites before, and I think you've witnessed these beings being escorted somewhere, and they were very confrontational, didn't want to be touched by whoever they were being escorted. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's another group. I'm not really too familiar with them.
Okay.
I have run into one once when I was in Nevada, but they have evidently their planet takes twice as long to rotate as ours. So their day is virtually twice as long as ours. And so they've been around forever, and they do seem to work with the U.S. government, but they don't seem to be the most advanced kinds. So they have some, and Jay Widener saw one of them in the Denver airport.
Right. I think that's the story you were telling me, how they were.
Yeah,
with some government-looking officials being
yeah,
escorted somewhere.
yeah. Jay Wider could do that, but basically it was a female, and she had the problem is they come from a planet with low gravity, and so they really struggle on Earth. Even the ones that was born there. That's probably the one that was born. She actually works for the U.S. government, I think, for the CIA or something. She was born in the time of Jeff. They lived like 800 years or something, and she
Mm.
was born in the time of President Adams on Earth. So I guess she's an American citizen. Maybe in this case a legal alien now. Uh, so that was probably her because they just have a hard time dealing with Earth's gravity, even if they were born here. It's just they're not really designed well for it.
You think at
But
the
they're
top of these feuding, powerful families that there is some sort of extraterrestrial race above them kind of pulling
oh yeah,
strings?
yeah. Well, there's the one they have one of the technologies they have is a technology that can extend their lifespan to centuries and human lifespans as well. And so in the friendship case, they have the W56s, which is the good guys supposedly, but they're actually not so good guys. And then there's the Contras, the bad guys who aren't not so bad guys. And anyway, these guys, the interesting thing is that the hierarchy is by height. And so they have this technology, and there's even a guy that got kicked out of their organization. He didn't really go high, and like Castronauts and Fitz talks about this one. These same people is you have a technology that can keep you eternally young, but it has a side effect, is that it causes your growth plates and your bones to reactivate. So every year you live, you get a little bit taller. It's like a crocodilian growth, and see that's one of the things. So when you look at their and they probably work for one of the Reptoid groups, this particular ones, and in the Italian case. And so like the top guy was over 10 feet tall, and he was the boss. Or no, he was like 12 feet tall. And then there's some guys that are like 10 feet tall. They're like second in charge, and then guys are 8 feet tall. And then so the hierarchy in the organization is entirely due to height. We don't see that in human society, but we do see hierarchy by age. And in this case, height and age are corresponds. And so that's why we see that hierarchy. And so they were talking about the one when Catherine Austin Fitz talks about this one guy who he was at the IMF, right, the International Monetary Fund meeting, and he accidentally went into the wrong room, right? So he was kind of a staff dude, but also a thing. And so he goes in there and he's sitting there, and like the top IMF guys are around a table, and in the front of the table there's this 8.5 foot humanoid talking to them, right? It's one of these friendship group guys.
Wow.
Yeah, so these guys are manipulating our society, and they that's if I guess I could grab the books later. We could talk about that. We could do a special show on that.
Yeah.
But basically, they're just a bunch of bullshit lying manipulators, and they had that friendship case. They got all these guys from Italy, and they're telling them, "Oh, we're here to help you, and we're your friends, and we're the good guys," and the whole spew, and they had them all do these ridiculous snipe hunt things for them to do that. But it was really they were just using them and manipulating and understanding how to control humans, and then finally they went away, but they really didn't go away. And then the guy writes, there's a book, Friendship. He writes it 50 years later, and he realizes 50 years after it's all over, they were kind of getting used, and they were being manipulated and used, and I mean, but these guys they paid in platinum. They paid this one guy, Breccio, who was the main character protagonist in the story, over 425 pounds of platinum.
Oh, wow.
That's a lot of money. And he had him built this. He had him build these special. They built a special villa for him because these guys are 8.5 foot tall. So they built this whole villa for that they could come and hang out at. Where for 9 foot tall people. So
Wow,
so that's and
crazy.
Cliff Hyde mentioned that too. He mentioned he was looking to buy a house on the West Coast, and he went to this house and everything was like giant sized. It's like the toilets were gigantic, the counters were gigantic. Like the counters came up to the mid chest on him, the kitchen counters,
Wow.
right?
Yeah.
Everything was just like supersized. And then the thing was, if you buy the house, all these things are going away. They're going to take them with them because they're obviously custom built, and then they'll put in regular sized stuff. And they said, oh, they were really tall people, basketball players, right? That was the excuse, right? But they never saw any pictures of them or anything.
Well,
so that's an
speaking of
example.
Cliff High, his Webbot prediction, according to that, we are entering sci-fi age where there will be possible contact with these beings, or that at least the general public will be fully aware that they exist somehow. And there's a lot happening right now. Of course, you hear the drone stories, and then on top of that, you see the videos of the weird plasmas that seem
Yeah,
to be at war with the drones.
yeah.
Very interesting things happening right now. I'd love to get your thoughts on all that.
Well, Cliff High and these other people, the future forecast people, looked into it. The remote viewers, and they actually saw something like that happening. They actually saw it. But I think what's happening is there is some sort of extraterrestrial, program going on. But then to cover up, the U.S. they're bringing out these drones, which are obviously ours, right?
Yeah.
They have they have the red and green lights and blinking lights and propellers, right? They're not from outer space. Okay, so I think they've got two things going on here. You probably do have some sort of extraterrestrial actions going on that are like getting people's attention, but to cover that up, to muddy the waters, they put their own drones out there to kind of like, so is it an alien? Is it a drone? And so if you look at it, it's you can't really tell, right? Because what is it, right? Is it a drone? And most people will just discount it all completely because they'll just call it a drone.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
the same way when there was UFO sightings. They get to come out and they call it swamp gas or the planet Venus, or they ridicule the person, right, or whatever. It's just a way of muddying the waters on what's really going on. Not that I know what's really going on, but there does seem to be some sort of there is, from the people in the know, there's some sort of like, there's certain groups of aliens are tired of like, there's like aliens that want humanity to succeed, and there's ones that want to keep us their slaves. And the first thing, that's why they don't want humans ever to know that they exist, aliens exist, or one group, because if humans ever came to understand that aliens really did exist in a mass, it would be like 2 weeks later they'd figure out, oh, we've actually been being controlled by aliens for the last 5,000 years, right? Because you look at some of the Sumerian paintings, right, or the Sumerian things, they have these really tall guys.
Mm.
The people are small, and they say, oh, they're just doing that because those guys are like the rulers. Well, not if these guys are using that life extension technology. Because they had this one guy, he was going to Harvard, and he'd gotten into Harvard, in certain ways, and then, but he was running to make money there. He was running the scams and stuff, and making money on the side, very, let's say, questionable but effective. And so finally, these guys in black came to him, black suits and stuff. They came to him, and he thought they were FBI agents, and he was being busted. And they said, no, we kind of, I know, we respect your initiative, and we would like to hire guys like you. And so eventually, they did his interview process, and finally he decided, yeah, he'd become part of it. And so he goes to, like, they go out to someplace out there in Boston, whatever. And he goes into a basement, and the guys say, okay, we're done. They signed some stuff, and he says, well, welcome to the group. And then out of a door opens up, and this 8.5-foot guy comes out. Probably Kenyon's the guy's name. He seems to be he's the guy. Kenyon was probably the guy talking in front of the IMF, and maybe this guy, and introduces himself and says, welcome to the team, right? But eventually this guy got kicked out of the team because he was just a little too unethical and making a little bit too on the side for himself, and so he got kicked out. They didn't kill him or anything, but then he just recounts his stories. Somebody, I have it recorded somewhere on my data, but who knows? I'd take a day or two to dig it out. So so these guys exist, and that technology exists, and they all seem to use it. That's why you have the extraterrestrials seem they live 800 years and they get taller and taller each time. But then you also see it like Saint Germain. Remember the story of Saint Germain? There's this guy. He knows how to speak all these languages. He doesn't eat the food, but he'd occasionally drink a glass of wine. But he has all this knowledge about history, like he was actually there. And every time people see him, he gets a little bit taller and taller and taller. And until finally he disappears. But he's come back. I mean, he was even a Saint Germain type guy at the formation of the United States of America. He was hanging out with the founding fathers at the pubs and giving them little things, and it was like the same guy, right? And I think he's a different group than the W56ers.
That's interesting. He's usually attributed to like vampire lore, but I've never really heard him compared to extraterrestrials, which is interesting.
Yeah, because he's got that technology. That technology, when you use it, you get taller and taller each time. And like they had one where there was going to be a plane crash because these aliens, extraterrestrials, actually can kind of like future forecast. And so they got like a body double, and these are not nice people, right? Because they have like operatives where they've put butts in their brains, This is back in the 50s, and like they needed a taxi driver, and all of a sudden this taxi driver would just appear out of nowhere and pick them up and then drive them, and then he'd drive back, and they were like ordinary Italians, right? That they'd program, they have some sort of mind control. They could just use them for their purposes. If they need a taxi driver, the guy probably didn't have any family. They could just take him over, and he'd go here to pick somebody up and take him here to pick up. And he was just like totally zombie mind controlled. And so they did that to somebody. They knew this plane was going to crash, or maybe they crashed it. And they had one of their guys, their operatives that they had working for them, because what happens is you never age and you get a little bit taller every year, right? And so after a while, if you're there really long, and they're never like, they're the assistant to the assistant secretary, right? Or the assistant to the CEO, right? They're always not the top leadership, but the guy right next to them. And it's going to be kind of hard to explain why you haven't aged for 20 years and you're getting taller all the time. So what happens is this guy was supposed to take this plane flight, but they actually got like a body double to go take the plane flight. So the plane crashes, and they identify this guy in the plane crash wreckage, right? He's one of the guys that died in the plane crash, but the guy didn't die. He actually went on to another operation. So they'll take him to another part of the planet, give him a whole new name, a whole new identity, and put him into the local community as like a spy and manipulator. So, he went from Italy to maybe, Argentina, right? And they'd have him where he worked there 10 or 15 years, and then there'd be an accident or something where he'd die, right? And they would never find the body or something, right? Or the body's terribly disfigured, right? And then by that time, and eventually you grow too tall when you're getting about 7 feet tall. It's kind of hard to explain why you're so tall. So then they go work underground in these underground bases where they work behind screens. Back then they were working behind screens and manipulating things, right? They're obviously an intelligence operation of some sort on manipulating humans and fighting the other people who are manipulating humans, right? And then as you get old, if you live long enough, you eventually, when you get to 8.5 feet tall, then you're the guy talking in front of the IMF. You're the guy bringing new people into the organization. And then when you're 10.5 feet tall, you're the guy running the organization. And at some point, you might even have to leave the planet because at that time you have problems. Like Andre the Giant had problems. So maybe you go off world to like, the moon or a lower gravity planet where, you're now a super boss for the aliens. But, they were claiming they had an off-world human type civilization with 600,000 people, yet they were using all this super advanced technology that you need a society of many, many millions, if not billions of people to create, right? When you have super high tech, 600,000 people can't make an advanced high tech technology. That's ridiculous. But these guys are using all this high tech. So obviously they're working for somebody else, a bigger society, a bigger organization. They're not the ones that came up with that technology. They're just workers. They're agents on the earth because they look human. They are humans. And some of them from off-world, humans that are living off-world. So there's obviously an off-world human population of those guys that get too tall. And then some of them come back to Earth. And then some of them are the ones recruited from Earth, right? Who eventually, if they live long enough, will become part of that organization.
We got a few minutes left. We had some tech difficulties. We're back. Ken was saying too much as usual. So in closing, how do you feel about where we're headed with this return administration, the Orange Emperor, UFOs, the reclaiming of new lands, and everything that is poised to unfold during the next 4 years? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's going to be pretty, the remote viewers see a whole lot of changes coming. And, Trump, the alternative was just their malevolent evil.
Was pure
Trump,
bowels of hell.
Yes, exactly. So Trump isn't like Mr. Perfect.
Right.
He's so much better than the alternative. And he speaks his own mind. He's his own person, good or bad. And so I think we are under a better administration than we would be under the psychos. I mean, not that Biden was running anything ever. Right. He was just a zombie who did what he was told, and it was just insulting actually to have him running he wasn't running anything. It was just insulting the whole fraud that was there.
Yeah.
So, but I think there is some sort of big changes coming. It's kind of like the Wu change, right? The old order is going away and the new one's coming up. I mean, if we look at the United States, you can't go on. I mean, the amount of just the interest on the national debt now, because the way they've been hyperinflating, the size of it is more than the tax income. They got to roll over $10 trillion of short-term bonds this year, and it's going to be like 5.5%, 6%. And about the end of the year, the amount of interest we got to pay on the bonds is more than all the taxes come in. That's not continuous. Either you got hyperinflation or you crash the economy,
Yeah.
right? Or they go to a super war, right? So that's, yeah. So, I mean, things are going to change. We are at a period of massive and rapid change. And it appears that also that maybe extraterrestrial forces are going to be intervening in a direct sense more than they've had before. Because maybe it's reached a point that, for the planet and other things where, they obviously value the planet as a functioning organism, and and they don't want it to be trashed either. So they're just, I think it's coming to a head in many different ways, and we're going to see massive changes. I think in 2025 and moving, especially toward 2027.
It's a hell of a time to be alive, I'll tell you that much.
Yes, it is. So buy extra popcorn and get ready for the unexpected.
Right on. Well, Ken, thank you so much. Fantastic information as usual. I'll have all your links in the description, and we'll definitely do this again soon in the future. And until next time, everyone, have a wonderful evening. We will talk again tomorrow. We'll see you then.